Welcome back to the Board Game Design Podcast based in Australia, although very lucky to have a special guest who's joining us from across the ditch, as the Kiwis would say, in Kenny Michael-Otton this evening, Australian time and New Zealand time. Great to be here for episode 3. For those watching or tuning in for the first time, basically the idea of this podcast is to educate the community a little bit on what goes into board game design, but to do it in a really kind of punchy and effective way. So our podcasts don't tend to go for longer than 40 to 45 minutes. It's a pretty organic chat. More the focus is on the designers for now, as opposed to any preconceived topics at all. But Kenny and I met at PAX in Melbourne last year, where he was kind enough to show me his game Scrap, which is now fully funded on Gamefound, which is super exciting. So I think, mate, to kick it off, really keen to know more about your journey on how you got into game design in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me on, by the way. So how did I get into design? I suppose, I could go all the way back to how I got into gaming, but as a very quick, I'll do that very quickly. So I really got into gaming proper when I was around 9 years old. I started playing Yu-Gi-Oh in the schoolyard, basically. Like I'd had Pokemon cards beforehand, but I never really played or didn't understand how to play it. But Yu-Gi-Oh was my first foray. And then from Yu-Gi-Oh, I ended up playing Duel Masters, and Duel Masters led to Magic. And then from playing Magic and a few other card games, there were a few friends I'd made who played board games, specifically Settlers of Catan, or now just Catan. As far as the design goes, I would say that I started seriously thinking about game design probably when I was 19. So that was just 10 years ago now. Was the first time I really started to, kind of consume more media on it, like listening to podcasts like this, or, different YouTube channels and such, talking about what are the mistakes designers make. That's a very common thing. Is a lot of different videos are all about like the pitfalls of design and what not to do. So surprisingly very discouraging, but not for me. I found it quite amusing. Where the Dice Tower top 10s and various things I actually found quite handy for that. So that was how I initially got interested in design. And then the real kind of, I had, little designs that I'd made here and there, and a couple of almost re-skins or re-themes of games that I'd played with a little twist or anything like that. But the first real serious design, the catalyst for that was COVID, as it turned out. So just being in lockdown gave me a lot more time, and a lot more indoor time specifically. Not that I was not already staying indoors a lot, but I decided to give it a crack. So March or early April 2020 was the first foray into a very serious, I am going to try and publish this game design.
Yep, fantastic. And kind of, I guess, as you say, COVID was a really big kind of catalyst for it, but you probably threw yourself in the deep end in quite a few ways as well. Just to kind of look back on that story, like you started off kind of hearing a lot of podcasts, watching a lot of videos on all the pitfalls and what not to do. And I agree, it can be a bit intimidating and a bit discouraging when a lot of the community in certain forums can be, not even just encouraging us to pressure test our ideas, but outright dissuading from even going down this path, even as a creative pursuit. So I guess to kind of, start that foray, or to kind of have that, I guess, insight or that perspective, but to go into something so heavy, right, and really throw yourself into deep end straight away. Just, run me through that process and that thinking for giving yourself a mighty big challenge first up.
For sure. So I guess what I wanted to do was, if I ever designed a game, I knew what I wanted to do was, I didn't want to just design it, I wanted to self-publish it, right? So not only am I a designer, I'm also a self-publisher. And the reason I wanted to do that was I'm very greedy about my creative control, effectively. I knew that if I wanted to design a game, if I only ever designed one game, basically, I wanted to make sure that it was really true to my vision and I had complete control over it, rather than kind of going, right, this is good enough, I'll sell it to this company, I'll get some royalties, and then they can do what they want with it. No, I really wanted to kind of carry my artistic vision all the way through. And I also knew that if I was only ever going to design one game, I didn't want to start off like a lot of designers do and design something really light, and just kind of test the waters and stuff. I went, if I only ever make one game, I want to make sure it's kind of the home run. Like this is, it's everything I want in a game, effectively. So that was kind of why I decided to just dive in and go for it. I did have, I'd spent a long time studying stuff in industry, and I've been playing board games now for 20 years or so. Plus, I have the benefit that my family also work in industry, and I do have some contacts and stuff that I suppose not all designers would have. So that made me a little more confident around it as well.
That's brilliant. There's a fair bit to unpick there. So thanks so much for such an extensive answer. I think that the couple of things that I've just picked up there as well was that you've had a really clear understanding for why you're going into this. And it's been a bit of a theme in the last couple of episodes as well, but just like knowing your why. And I think that the couple of sound bites that have really come through for me, like carrying that artistic vision, like you've got that, it's a vision that you have that you want that full creative control over. So having that as a really key area for your why that then led you down the self-publishing part as opposed to a publishing part. And then secondly, I'm a big sports nut. You don't create an AFL licensed sports game if you're not a sports nut, but I just love the analogy there around a home run. Like you made a very deliberate strategy that you want to go for it all first up. And I think like having that sense of purpose is so important, right? Because if you don't know your why and if you don't know your game plan, it's so easy to go scattergun. It's easy, I think, with a game plan to go scattergun when there's so much conflicting advice out there and so much discouraging advice out there. But yeah, I think having that kind of really core purpose and that really solid foundation, has really set you up for the success that you've had. I'm keen to understand a bit more about, you mentioned the study that you've done and how you're probably over-index maybe relative to other first-time designers, the amount of study to help you set up for success. Help me understand exactly, what study you did, what you were looking out for, how you even how you studied, did you take notes, as much of that process as you could elaborate on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess to talk about it more, I mean, I'm again looking at it also from a self-publishing perspective more than a design. So design is certainly more art and free form. There's things that you can do and things that you can study around mechanics and that kind of thing. So I did like a little bit of reading of various, articles about game theory and that kind of thing. But I find sometimes they tend towards kind of abstraction or academia in a sense where, yes, like some of the things are true and they're applicable, but they're not always perfect for what you're trying to go for. A lot of the time, the best way to, get information and study how to design a game is to design a game and then keep going and just iterate. I actually used to watch a lot of a YouTube channel called Extra Credits, which is it's actually a game design channel, but primarily oriented towards video game design.
Interesting.
Because the thing is that video game design and board game design do have, like, the core mechanics of them, right, have overlap, right? You're designing an interactive experience for players to enjoy. There's obviously a lot of things that are not the same, but even so, there are lessons that you can learn from both. So I'd certainly encourage, because video game design, I guess, is a much more established medium. There's a lot more, podcasts and different things that you can go out there and listen to on that as well. So Extra Credits is a big recommend for me, especially a lot of the older stuff. I don't watch it as much anymore, but they had a lot of gems in the old stuff. So that's kind of the design side. But on the publishing side, I started looking more seriously into that when I was well into the design process. So I would say that I first looked at publishing. When I say first looked at it, I mean, I had watched YouTube videos and such on it, but actually sourcing more information was probably in late 2021. So about a year or so, or a year and a half out from actually going to the Gamefound campaign. And at that point, what I was really looking for, honestly, was a lot of manufacturing information, because I knew that design is one thing. Like, I've played a lot of games, and so I have some understanding, at least, of how games operate and what systems are interesting and what creates engagement in a game. But as far as, global logistics, manufacturing, all of that, graphic design, etc., there wasn't much that I really knew. So I was very fortunate in that when you start posting about the fact that you're looking for play testers or that you're designing a game, in various Facebook groups, you get reached out by every manufacturer under the sun. Which is good and bad, because obviously it just means a lot of turning people down and so on and so forth. But I was very fortunate that Gameland, who is the manufacturer that I'm using, had particularly strong communication, and they were very patient. And so I came in basically with a list of questions around the entire manufacturing process. Like, how does this work? Why is the cost for this more expensive at this number than at this number? Or can you show me the scaling around certain things? I do have like a business and economics background somewhat, so I understand like supply chains and that kind of things and economies of scale. So that was helpful. But really, it was just finding a manufacturer that was willing to field all of the questions. And I told them up front, I said, look, I am so far away from actually manufacturing that I'm probably going to be wasting your time. So please, feel free to ignore me. But they were awesome. And I think if you wear your heart on your sleeve and you're very earnest and forthright about your agenda, people are happy to help.
Yeah.
I had another shout out as well. I did have an American manufacturer who I will say I can't remember who they were now, but who helped me out initially talking about GSMs and all of that for paper thickness and that kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure.
And even being very straightforward about it and saying, look, to be honest, you're probably better off getting it manufactured in China. Like the costings are just way cheaper. Like they're more efficient and they're cheaper. So it's only very specific reasons why. Yeah, exactly. There's so many things. There's a lot of misconceptions, I think, around manufacturing in China. But that generally, I would say that the manufacturer themselves have been a treasure trove of information. So my advice to anyone out there who is looking into, potentially self-publishing their own game, you want to get in contact with the manufacturer as soon as possible and just tell them you're an idiot, basically, and that you're going to ask a million different questions and see how you go.
And that's completely okay, right? Like, as you said, it's not something that, even with an economics background, right? You've never manufactured something before. So it's okay to go in with all the dumb questions, right? Because if you don't go in with those questions, then ultimately you're going to end up with incomplete information, and then the brief isn't going to be as good, and then your manufacturer who you choose ultimately isn't going to be the right one. So
that's right.
Yeah, it all makes heaps of sense. In terms of what you said, like the timeline between, I guess, researching to self-publish and then ultimately launching was 18 months. Had you kind of pegged that out, that you're looking to launch in 18 months' time when you made that decision to start researching, or did the timeline flow a bit more organically than that?
It did flow a little bit. So I had originally estimated that I was going to launch a year out from when I was first looking in. So originally I was scheduled to launch around July or August in 2022, and I ended up moving it to 2023 for a few reasons. I was running a little bit behind on a couple of things, but also I ended up getting like a little unwell towards the latter half of 2022. So that delayed things quite a lot. So it's possible I could have launched in late 2022 had I not been unwell. But unfortunately, I was unwell for quite a few months. All better now.
Yeah.
No, that's all good.
Yeah.
No, it's all good. So I did have a rough plan, and I think it's important to have timelines, right? Of course, they're flexible to an extent. I mean, when you're in the creative space, you can really be as flexible as you want. But you got to kind of draw the line at a certain point as well. So something that's really important for me, as an example, is I'm going on some holidays and that kind of thing in June. So I know I'm going to be quite busy. Like I'm going overseas to Thailand for a couple of weeks. And then I'm going to visit some family in Australia because it'll be my birthday and all that kind of thing. So as such, I know that June will be a wipeout, basically. And as such, I really want to make sure that all of my design is finished in May.
Sure.
And I'm very confident in design, but every single time I design and play my game and everything, there's always something I go, this could be a little bit better. I could make this better. This is a slight wrinkle that I could fix or something like that. But you've got to draw a line at some point. And I think that's it's a challenging thing for me, certainly, because I want to make sure that my game is right. And I'm at the point now where the wrinkles are so small that if I had to launch, if I had to say tomorrow we're done, we're launching it, I'd be confident. But I'm using the rest of this time to kind of iron out just as many little creases as I can. But I think setting yourself a timeline and trying your best to stick to it is actually a really good thing for creativity. I think that when you're kind of just designing and you're going, well, I'll just design today and that's all well and good. Often I find personally that I really struggle in those times when you're kind of open some of my best design inspirations have actually come when I know I've got a physical playtest coming up and I need to go to the printer. So then when I say the printer, I mean the Officeworks. And yeah,
whatever works, right?
Yeah, that's right. Whatever works. And on that day, I need to update all of the assets and everything. And as I'm updating the assets, I'll go, this ability, like I don't like this one. I've got to change it to something. What am I going to change it to? And sometimes under that pressure, like the time pressure of I need to go print it in an hour because I've got my playtest in 3 hours, it's actually a real way to get those creative juices flowing. So
yeah, a bit of a catalyst in that way.
Yeah, exactly. Timelines are really good for that.
100%. I think that like you touched on a really important point, and I'm probably in a similar boat as a solo designer / self-publisher as well, that a lot of other designers talk about the importance, or even just in business in general, talk about the importance of having partners, and that, that partner, when you have that accountability to each other, it helps kind of force things forward. But when you're not in that situation, and there are a lot of solo designers out there, of self-publishers like us, there needs to be a mechanism in there that keeps it going forward and needs it to keep accountable. So I think that the way how you've used key milestones in there to help kind of, make sure that you're progressing and that things are on track is a really good mechanism for yourself. But I'd again encourage anybody who's listening or watching in that if you are doing it on your own, what are those milestones that you're going to set just to set yourself accountable? Because this is a side hustle for a lot of us, right? There's very few full-time game designers, so there's always going to be conflicting priorities. And if we're not advocating for ourselves, then ultimately things aren't going to get done. So yeah, I think that's really a sound advice. I think even going back, there's so much to dive into, mate, with what you just said then. I think even going back to like your overall timeline. So a big part of it was focused on the actual research and I guess upskilling yourself with the whole manufacturing. Well, one, what was needed, then secondly, diving a bit more into the manufacturing process. Can you help me understand as well, like some of the other kind of key areas? One, how you divided the timeline up, but then also some of the other key skills that you realized you had to generate in order to ultimately get to where you got to?
You've touched on one of my favorite things. So I think what I would say is one of the most fun parts for me personally, this may not be everyone's cup of tea, your mileage may vary, but one of the most fun parts of this for me has actually been developing all of the side skills that are involved in publishing. So I'll park that for a second, come back to it. So in order to answer the first one as to how I divvied up the time, I suppose that I don't know if I had a strict way of divvying up the time. I more just had information that I knew I needed to seek, right? So the way I did it was if there was a period of time where I felt like, for whatever reason, as an example, when I was unwell, it was a bit hard for me to actually play test. And so a lot of my time there was dedicated towards the manufacturing side because I could just go online and ask questions and that was fine. And I could basically seek out the information I needed. So generally what I would do is I would work out what pieces of information I actually needed and then just keep going until I got that information. So it was more that way, rather than being, like a lot of things, I guess, in my process, rather than slicing up specific time and saying, this is how much time is dedicated for this thing. It was more, here is a goal. I need to work towards that goal. Right. Yeah, and I'll just keep hammering at it until I achieve that particular goal. And the goals don't have to be wide, like really lofty goals, right? It doesn't have to be I'm going to completely design a new faction and then keep going until it's completely balanced. Not like that. It could even be something as a design goal. It could be I am going to see what happens if I pursue red as this faction. Like it's much more micro than that. You definitely, your kind of branching goal is, your wide goal is, I want to get this game balanced, but you got a lot of micro goals in there. And even in the publishing process, you still have micro goals. Your goal is, I need to work out international shipping and I need to work out how much manufacturing costs. But a micro goal there could be, I need to work out the most effective way to, represent the pieces in my game. How am I going to do that? What are the different, one of the things you have to do in order to self-publish is you need to be able to produce manufacturer-ready files. So one way you can do that is you can pay a graphic designer to do it. But it's easy enough to self-teach yourself that. I didn't have too much of a problem with it. I am somewhat tech literate, but I haven't used graphic design or arts programs before, and I was able to work it out. And I did have a few friends who helped me out with it, who I'm very thankful for. But I actually found going through the process of preparing a print ready file really quite almost like a game in itself. You're trying to economize space and make it so you use as much of your punch board as possible, which is quite fun. But on top of that, what I found I really enjoyed was like video editing, as an example.
Okay,
I once again found I tried recently to kind of not outsource that, but sell that service, because I felt like I did a decent enough job that I could help other people. And I found that I really enjoy being creative with it rather than someone telling me what to do. So it's certainly a skill that you know I enjoy doing for myself, but I don't think I'd sell it to other people anymore. But going through that process and developing, video editing, basic animation, graphic design, they're not necessary skills at all. So they're not necessary skills that you yourself need to develop. You can always outsource, but the more you can do yourself, the lower you can keep your costs as well. Plus, skill development is very satisfying. So the fact that I can now, say that I need to prepare a print ready file tomorrow, the fact that I can now go do it and I don't have to pay a graphic designer to do it is a big deal. It's investing in the future of, I guess, my company and my brand effectively. I don't like using the term brand, but the idea being, the Jolly Swagman Games, my publishing company that I'm trying to run.
100%. And I think that I was even just listening to a podcast this morning of a founder of a sunscreen brand. And she was remarking how even now that she has scale and investors behind her, like she's still the e-commerce manager, she still does social, she still fulfills some orders, she's the account manager, even as she's expanded, right? Like it's, you don't get into this gig for passive revenue. I think that's one, that's one certainly pretty early learning that I found, that even, through the journey, right? Like, in time, hopefully, depending on motivation, there might be some areas of the supply chain, the value chain that are outsourced, but just having this real hustle mindset that it's just so important to see everything as a self-development exercise firstly, and then secondly as a cost minimization exercise. Like if you think the quality's there, you don't have to pay for it, then even better.
Yeah, exactly. What I always said with my campaign page and everything. So like if anyone goes and checks out my campaign page, which is still, it's not live per se, the campaign is finished, but it's still there. I basically made all of that page myself. There were a couple of things where one of my friends in Sydney, shout out to Lauren and James, they helped me with taking the photos and they had a better camera setup and everything. But as far as, making the layout for it and everything and putting the information and such, that was all me that I put together. And I tried to say that a lot of what I tried to come across as was authentically amateur. Not to the point where it was terrible, right? So like, sometimes if you look at a Kickstarter page, sometimes there could be a great game there, but it is tragic, right? The page is awful. It just screams, unprofessional. And so I felt like I had gotten my skills to the point where I could look okay. Like it wasn't at the point where, people would switch off because the page looked unprofessional or anything, but it wasn't, like a massive company level, here is an awesome video and here's all of these GIFs and everything. I always hesitate on the word GIF. I'm like, is it GIF? Is it GIF? But I've gone with GIF today. And I actually, that was kind of an intentional decision on my part where, it was a cost saving mechanism for sure. But I also think that, there's certainly an exhaustion in the industry to some extent around big companies using Kickstarters. Like there's at least a vocal minority, who is quite, jaded with the idea of big companies using it as like a pre-order system. And so I wanted to really convey that idea that, hey, I am actually the type of person that this system was made for. And I think that coming across and doing most of the stuff myself and having, as you said, the hustle mentality where I was doing all the stuff myself, I think that made it much more clear. Well.
How do you think you're able to communicate that, like apart from maybe some of your optics on the page itself, being at a necessary level, but not with some of the bigger budgets that the big companies have? How are you kind of authentically able to communicate that message through your page as well, that you are a first-time designer and you are giving it a crack like the platform was originally intended for?
I guess one thing I tried to express really clearly, my day job is communication, right? Like I'm a trained communication specialist. That doesn't mean I'm an expert at social media and my optics are not always going to be ideal, but I understand how to communicate a message effectively. And a key thing that I did was I was just really transparent about everything. So, I basically, I don't love jargon, right? So a lot of my page is very plain speak, where I just say, this is how it is. Please be aware this is the case. And a lot of it, as I said, just came through like, I understand that a lot of campaigns do this. I am not doing this. And it's actually in my FAQ. So an example, a question I got asked a few times from people was like, where's the minis? Like, why aren't you doing minis? This game would do so much better if you were doing minis. And yeah, possibly. If I had the capital up front to lay for it, but to lay out for it. But there were a lot of decisions around not going for minis. And I wanted to make that really clear, again, in it, where I said, this is not part of the project scope. So I think that was a key thing, was I went no stretch goals at all, right? And I made that clear from the start that there were going to be no stretch goals, that this was a game that was done and it didn't need anything else. And if any stretch goals were to be included, they're going to be almost retrospective ones. Like, oh, I can do this slightly cheaper. I'll add this on. Or, hey, I actually did
landed as well. For someone who hasn't backed many Kickstarter or Gamefound games, it seems like stretch goals are almost a prerequisite. I think that's a pretty courageous call that, here's my game, it's finished. It doesn't need these add-ons to be complete or to be fun. But yeah, it seems like almost swimming against, like, I admire the courage to kind of swim against the tide, but to have a finished product. But what kind of led you to that decision, and how do you think you navigated the feedback that came accordingly?
Absolutely. I think it's a fine line between courageous and stupid for me. I certainly, kind of toe that line a little bit with a lot of my things. I often said, when people ask me, I said, I feel like I did everything, to go off on a slight tangent, I did everything kind of against what a lot of the advice was talking about. Now, I didn't I didn't read all of the articles and go, this is rubbish. I kind of, again, intentionally went, well, okay, this advice is applicable for these reasons. Does it apply to me, or can I make it not apply to me? So an example was like around pricing, right? So an interesting thing for Scrap is that, just a little peek behind the curtain, most of the time they recommend that you price your game MSRP based. So 5 to 6 times, basically it's 5 to 6 times your landed cost. Is what they recommend you price it at. Now, I can tell you that if I followed that method for Scrap, then Scrap would have been over $200. And I priced it at 125 and 150, which a lot of people still kind of raised their eyebrow and were like, "Oh, that seems quite expensive," when actually it was cheap based on the production costs. And I made that kind of clear in how I conveyed everything. And with, I guess, with a lot of the other things that I did in the campaign, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Remind me of the question. Remind me of the question again. This could be edited out.
Oh, essentially, the not doing stretch goals.
Stretch goals. Cool. Yeah. Okay. So I guess what I did intentionally was with stretch goals in a lot of campaigns that I have backed in the past. Yeah, they're an appealing thing, but the reality of them is they're a marketing trick, right? So for the most part, for companies like Simon, as an example, where they did Zombicide recently. When they put out that you're getting all of this free stuff, you're not really, like, actually, if you do the calculations based on the initial pledge, you're not actually getting much for free. You might be getting some, don't get me wrong, like they can hit at the scale where they can give you stuff for free and it's fine. But a lot of the initial goals, at the very least, are paid for in your initial pledge. But then all they're doing is they're just adding the goals afterwards and going, oh, here's this cool thing that you unlocked. It's a psychological trick, but that is marketing generally, right? I don't begrudge them for doing it, but I guess what I wanted to, because I was trying to come across as kind of authentic and, straight to the point, going, I understand that this is a thing that a lot of people do. And, stretch goals are used to kind of generate excitement and stuff. But again, it's just marketing gimmicks. And what I tried to avoid, I guess, in my campaign was gimmicks. It was, here is a product. And I really banked on people seeing that it was an authentic indie project, basically. Now, was it, it's impossible to measure whether that was successful or not. I can certainly say that I funded. Would I have funded better if I engaged in, stretch goals and other various things that you can do? Maybe, but I don't know. I'm pretty satisfied with how the campaign went overall. As I said, I funded well over what I thought I would. I'm now able to produce the game. That's great. Like, considering all that.
Mission accomplished, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Job done.
Yeah, and I think that there's a bit of a common theme there as well with your project planning, right? That it's being comfortable drawing a line somewhere. It's not if you don't kind of have that measure of success where you can define, do I keep going with this or do I draw the line? I think that applies with ultimately the success of the campaign as well. And you're funded, right? Like there's always going to be question marks as to what more could have been done, but man, like it's a hypothetical you're never going to get an answer to. So I think it's wise to draw the line somewhere and with a green light outcome, right? Which is fantastic.
Yeah, that actually, you've reminded me of a really important point I want to talk about, which is marketing itself. So we talked about stretch goals, but the whole marketing process. Marketing was the process that I was the least comfortable with, despite the fact that I had done a little bit of study with it. I mean, the study I had done was fairly basic marketing principles and stuff. So like, I understand that part, but functionally, how do I create an ad? How do I measure these things? Or what raw information can you actually get from an ad? So like, as an example, say that I put out 2 ads. You can do what they call an A test, like A/B test, right? Where you send out 2 ads advertising the same thing, but there's a slight change in how they're targeted or whatever. And you can measure and check, how many responses and ticks and stuff you got. But really what you're doing in those cases is you're just making educated guesses, right, around why something worked or why something didn't. And I guess that level of uncertainty made me a little bit uncomfortable, especially with the pricing of how much marketing generally costs. So here's an example. A cheap quote I got for just like a landing page was about $1,000. And that was insane to me because, again, I had to think about it from just like a cost benefit point, right? Where I said, okay, a landing page that does look professional, right? All of the winning Kickstarters have these landing pages and stuff. But for my campaign, if I fork out $1,000, are 1,000, am I going to get another, say, 20 backers because I have a landing page? Is it worth it? And especially as like an individual, right? Like if you're a company, you can kind of, like a bigger corporation, you can accept $1,000 of risk and go, all right, we'll try it out. And if we break even, that's fine. But for me, that's $1,000 out of my bank. That's, it's not a small amount of money.
Understand the trade-offs, right? And make an informed decision accordingly.
That's basically it. Like I did very minimal marketing, I would say. A lot of the stuff I did was organic. And I did spend about $1,000 on advertising through various Facebook groups and stuff. And I need to do a little bit of information gathering around how that went. But my general suspicion, to be honest, is that most of the traffic and the backers that I got were actually organic. It was actually from me just going out there and talking about my game and, interacting with people and people encountering it on Gamefound that actually brought in the most traffic, as opposed to contests and banners and that kind of thing. Again, I don't know. I can't say for certain, but just kind of based on the backer demographics, I would say that's the case, because I think a lot of the advertising things I used were more targeted towards like the US audience. And I would say the US audience is like much less than half of the back account. Whereas like the Australian audience is the majority of it. And that would have all come through organic, interactions and that kind of thing. So I would certainly recommend that, get your game out there quickly and just make yourself known to people, be willing to play test and talk and share and be a gamer, basically. That's a lot of what I try and do. Is I'm happy to just talk shop with people and all of that. They can play my game or not, but I'll just talk with them and let them know what I'm working on. And I think that's a really important thing.
100%. And how even this interview came across tonight, really, in a way, like without you being at PAX and as mixing down, you've been willing to talk to myself and beautiful wife about how the game works. And it's amazing what comes as a result of it, right? I want to touch on that, but before we do, and to kind of continue the theme around your Gamefound and your page, really keen to understand like why Gamefound. I know Kickstarter's the more established platform, and Gamefound had a really ambitious revenue target last year that they fell short of, but they still grew significantly. But it's probably a question for a lot of self-publishers, like which platform to choose. So really keen to get your thoughts on I guess what an analysis you did to make the call, and how ultimately you think it played out.
Yeah, it's a tough one, right? And again, it's the kind of thing where how it played out is, all I can say is I funded on Gamefound, and I don't know if I would have funded better on Kickstarter or worse or whatever, but I can just, objectively, all I can say is that I funded. But I can talk through the decision process that got me there. So initially I was going to go with Kickstarter. That was fine. What led me towards Gamefound particularly was a few things. Number one, I know that Kickstarter is very hands-off in a way, right? Okay. You kind of, it's a platform that you go on, you put your game on, and then they're just like, cool, we'll leave you to it. And then that's all, right? Whereas I'd heard anecdotally from a few people that the Gamefound team are a little bit more involved, because Gamefound is more specifically for board games. The people running the company know a few things about board games. And so as such, they can ask you questions and all that. It's a little more tailored and a little more hands-on. It wasn't as hands-on as I thought it was going to be, I will say. Like it was, but it was still more involved than otherwise. And anecdotally, there were a few people from the Gamefound team who, kind of not informal interactions, but kind of around the place, like on Facebook and stuff, would pop up and say hi and, cheer you on and everything. So that was nice. A few other reasons though. A practical reason was that Gamefound had its pledge manager integrated with itself. So when you use Kickstarter, it doesn't naturally come with a pledge manager. I believe that actually recently changed. They're in the process of integrating a pledge manager into their service, but at the time when I was using it, that was not the case. And it was just, there gets a point where you have to, again, draw a line on what you can cope with. So like through this process, I learned all about manufacturing. I learned somewhat about international freight and logistics and stuff. I learned about graphic design. I learned about animation and stuff. And then it just, when I was trying to find pledge manager information, that was just slightly too far. And I was like, this is getting much more complicated than backers' money is then accurately recorded and transferred to a different site. And then that site will take some cut of the money. So like it increased the cost. And all the information I could find, I was struggling to find information around it, but it seemed like the cost was higher than, in my opinion, the benefit that it was being provided. So again, cost benefit analysis, it just wasn't worth it. Whereas Gamefound came with it for free. It's like, it's for free. It's in the same spot. That was an easy big tick. A few other things though. So I like Gamefound's vision in the sense that they're very much trying to be more backer-centric, and they're obviously all for board games. So some key things as an example that I actually integrated as part of my campaign. Number one was the stable pledge option. Basically, that meant that if the price at the end of the campaign, like say that something went wrong, like there's been a few companies recently where some significant things have gone wrong and backers have been charged, or basically been told you need to pay an extra $150 or we cannot send you your game. Like that's quite a bit of money. And the stable pledge was basically, I think, developed in response to that, where if the price of the end product shifted by more than 10%, then Gamefound would give the backer an entire, like a full refund, including the Gamefound fee, if the backer wanted it. So if the backer was happy to pay, fine. But I wanted that safety, especially as a first-time designer. I wanted people to understand that I'm not trying to fleece them. Like if there was something, that went wrong, you have the option to back out. So that was a big plus for me as well. And the other thing as well was they basically introduced Afterpay for the campaign. So where you could back the game and then pay it off in installments. And it's quite a good thing, right? So it's good for me because it's kind of a halfway point between $1 pledging, where the backer pays only $1, and then in the pledge manager they go up, and full pledging, because full pledging is great for me but bad for the backer, and $1 pledging is great for the backer and bad for me. So the installments pledge is kind of, it's really good for me because it still boosted up the campaign by the full amount, but it's not as bad for the backer, right? Because they're not paying they're not paying the full amount up front. So they can have it in the savings account and only pay it later on or anything like that. So those were kind of the considerations I made when I decided to go for Gamefound. As I said, would it have ended up being better if I went on Kickstarter? Who knows? Kickstarter certainly has a lot more organic traffic, like that's undisputable. But would they have all come to my game? Maybe in an alternate timeline. I can work that out.
100%. And with more organic traffic to the site also comes more competition, right? In terms of the amount of games that are also on Kickstarter as well, and how well they segment different games, and is their navigation, maybe as nuanced as Gamefound because specifically made for a gaming platform. But I think for me, the overall kind of takeout there is like it's really well considered, and that you took your time again to do your research to understand what are the nuances and like what's right for you. And I think that for a game that is priced around $125, $150, as you said, like a lot of those securities in terms of afterpay, paying installments, if anything goes wrong, then there's the option to back out. Like it's all very consistent with how you want to come across and how your game is themed. So not by chance, and all very thematically linked through. Yeah,
absolutely. Like pretty much, I guess a lot of what I would say with all of the stuff, because I know that it's a complex process, right? There's lots of different things involved. Like if you think the design process is hard, all of the production stuff is trickier, right? Because design is art, right? Again, people like it or they don't. And generally the only cost you're paying is your time. And so, if people don't like it, that's fine. You can change it. But if you've suddenly paid $23,000 for a bunch of games and then the boat doesn't exist anymore, and now you have to get them on a different boat and that boat costs more, that's more, fear inducing. And again, that has not been my experience at the moment, but it's just because there is inherently more risk involved. I think it's something that you definitely need to consider a lot more. And I think a lot of the mistakes that happen for a lot of people is because there's not much consideration. Now, touch wood, I haven't had too many problems. There has been a little bit of a shipping thing on my end, but that's just more related to, I think there was a slight miscommunication around some quotations for freight and that kind of thing. So again, I guess that's an example of, even with a lot of preparation and consideration, mistakes can still happen, miscommunications happen, and all that kind of thing. And then it's just being calm and being able to find new solutions to it. So understanding how to look for information is a big thing too.
100%. Like, there's so many more questions I could ask, right? In terms of, again, like how you found packs, the overall play testing process. We spoke offline about, a game as heavy as yours, how you play tested and convince people to play test, to back ultimately. But we're almost out of time. So I guess just to kind of close, one more question from me, and then I'll throw it open to you for a question back at me if you have one as well. But I guess, like, what's next now, right? Like you kind of said up front that if you only design one game, you want it to be the home run. You've got it funded. Has this given you a taste for something more, or is it all about just getting Scrap completely fulfilled and shipped out to your backers before you start, kind of flexing that art and creativity again?
Good question. So, funnily enough, one of the hardest things for me recently has actually been trying to contain all of the other ideas in my head, because I'm so ready to dive into the next one. Like, awesome. I've got so many games that I want to design that I think have interesting themes and all of that. So there's two more. I think what I'm going to do next time with Scrap, I focused intensely on it. I wanted to make sure that if I got everything right and I just focused on the one. But now I get the process a lot more. I've been through it. The reception to Scrap has been overwhelmingly positive. Like, so many, like all the reviewers who I sent it to really enjoyed the game. And none of the reviewers I sent it to were paid, by the way, as well. That was another intentional, something for another time. But an intentional thing I did was no paid reviewers, which was great for finances and also just made me a little less concerned about bias. but all the reviews there were really positive. All of the player feedback has been really positive. So I'm feeling awesome about that. And that has just, I've gone, hey, you know what? I can actually design a game. This is, I can do it. And so I've got a game, funnily enough, about the Murray-Darling River Basin. It's not actually, it won't physically be the Murray-Darling in the game. It'll be something else. But it's basically around river systems. At the moment, I'm trying to decide if I want to swing really heavy and go almost for a scientific simulation, or if I want to go a little less and try and capture a different nuance. But that's called floodplain is what that's called.
Floodplain, nice.
Floodplain. And then another game I'm working on at the moment is, again, completely different. It's called Spotlight, which is a game that at the moment I'm deciding between a theme of pop bands. So like, you know, you could be like a K-pop band or something like that, or alternatively cheerleading. So like competitive cheerleading. And kind of the mechanic in that I think will be interesting is trying to arrange dance moves in your hand, and it's got a static hand mechanism where you can't rearrange your cards. Kind of like, it's inspired a bit by this game called Scout, which I played reasonably recently. It's a pretty popular trick-taking-ish game. Or not a trick taker, a hand emptier is what it is, but similar genre. And that's kind of inspired me to look at this and try and put that same mechanism in a slightly more complex game. And then there's historical war games and all kinds of things that I want to make. So certainly lots more to come from me. And I think a lot of the $500 backers for my campaign will be pretty happy, I think, because I've got so many games I want to design, and they'll be getting copies of them all for free in the future.
That is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. And I think what I was saying before was one of the hardest things for me in the last few months have actually been kind of the come down from the campaign. So like it's a weird thing, funding, because it kind of like, I had this feeling of like, I did it, you know? I've got it.
I conquered the mountain.
That's right. And so then actually looking at Scrap, I'm like, but it's funded. It's, you know, it's done. And I know it's not. Like, I've got a few more things to wrinkle out. But I think in combination with moving overseas and adjusting to new life and everything, it's actually trickier almost to do the final bits on a game once you know it's funded. So I think that's something I'll do next time is with Scrap, I knew I was 95% done, right? And there was a bit more to iron out. When I go for my next games, I need to make sure they're 100% done, because I think funding does a weird thing to me psychologically where I'm like, oh, it's done. And it's almost like a ticked box. And, you know, then my brain was like, what's next? So I got to keep it contained, basically.
Yeah. And like a really good learning to come out of it, right? And again, kind of goes back on that theme of how do you set yourself milestones, and when something's done, how you're confident in your mind for your own sense of success and satisfaction, and keeping yourself accountable that it's done, rather than that line beginning to creep and then the workload beginning to creep. And you know, as you say, like, it's a side hustle, right? So we need to manage our time and energy accordingly, and the ramifications that has for the project. So it's so exciting though that, you know, it's not just a one and done home run and you're out of here.
Right.
But you've kind of got the, you know, creative itch to get back on the horse pretty quickly, which is pretty cool.
So many more, and there won't be a break, basically. So what will happen is, you know, as a fun thing, at the end of this month, once I'm basically getting ready to submit all the files for Scrap, I've discovered that I very much like creativity and arts, right? So when I'm over in Thailand, I'm entering a short story competition. Nice. not in Thailand itself, it's online. But I'll be doing some flash fiction stuff, which is a fun little competition. And then the moment I come back from Thailand, it's not like rest on my laurels, Scrap is done. It's let's get to it on the next one. So I think I'm very fortunate in that way, the way my brain works is it's just constantly looking for more and more to do, to busy itself with. So
absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Well, mate, just before we close here, did you have a question for me at all, or potentially a question for the community that I can even ask our next guest on the show as well?
Oh, it's an excellent question. So I think I'm going to pose a question to you, which is, I guess, out of anything that I discussed today, what was something that you found personally the most interesting?
Oh, that is a great question. I think and I was going to do a bit of a recap at the end. I was going to have a short list of probably 3 to 6 points that so I might cheat a little bit and mention those out and then think about what's the one that really stands out to me. I think that the first one for me, like I'll start back with the vision. Like a lot of people have the question straight away, like when that first decision, do you self-publish? Do you go with a publisher? Like you had a really clear understanding with, you want this artistic vision. I want to go for a home run. I'm going to do it all myself. So I think that's kind of the first key point to really land. I think secondly, this is a bit of a macro theme, and this is maybe the answer to your question, is I think that like you've consciously and subconsciously thought about your think, feel, do really, really clearly. And what I mean by that is often even like in public speaking, right? And maybe even for people listening to this podcast and watching it as an interview is like, think really carefully when you're messaging with what you want your audience to think, which is the more logical side, what you want them to feel, which is more emotive, and then lastly, what you want them to do. And make sure that everything that you do is consistent with that experience. So I kind of think about everything from the think perspective is, what did you research? Like the fact that you did research, you had timelines, you kept yourself accountable. You know that you're doing it solo, so not having a business partner, you had to find a way to keep it going. And even chatting through now about what this means for getting 95 to 100, what checks and balances are you putting in so that that's really clear? I think then from a feel perspective, again, how everything laddered back to, you're doing this to not just to build your own skill set, but you want to come across as authentic and you want to make it really clear that you're doing this to connect with people. It's an outlet for creativity. You're really passionate about art. So how can you evoke that message of feeling to everybody? So that ultimately the combination of do is people are interested in your game. They want to understand more about it. And at the end of the day, they want to back it on Gamefound. So I think that how all that culminates into a really consistent narrative through a lot of just who you are as a person and the passion that you have for the project, but also a lot of really deliberate thought on what are the trade-offs here, what are the risks that I'm willing to take, such as learning these whole new skill sets from scratch and keeping an open mind with it, versus no, you know what, like I'm not going to pay $1,000 for this because I know that with my margins it's roughly an extra 20 backers that I need, and I'm not confident I'll get an ROI. Like that's all really clear and deliberate thinking. And I think that for me is probably the overarching takeout. Really, it's just have a plan, know why you're getting into it for, and try to have a degree of consistency across every design choice or every project choice that you make. And if you're doing something that maybe the risk appetite is slightly out there or slightly different to it, pressure test yourself to understand like what's the cost benefit, and is a risk here worth taking because of all this other stuff that I'm doing here that I kind of feel I'm more comfortable going out doing this specific thing.
Yeah, I think being deliberate, both in a publishing sense and a design sense. So, making a deliberate decision around why you're doing something in a game and a deliberate decision around why you're doing something on a publishing end is really critical. Like, if you ever can't answer the question, why are you doing something, then it's certainly time to reevaluate. Like, you need to have really strong rationales as to why you're doing things. Again, both on the design and the publishing side.
Yeah. That is a wonderful closing comment, I reckon, Kenny. So yeah, thanks again so much, mate, for joining. For everybody watching and listening, we're still at the very kind of start of this podcast / interview journey. Certainly provide feedback, comments, questions, additional things that you'd like to hear going forward. But again, thanks, Kenny, for such wonderful insights and contributions this evening. And I hope everybody watching and listening got a few things out of it. I know I certainly did. Cheers.
Yeah, no worries. You're very welcome, Andrew.